Passenger Seat Podcast, a podcast designed to fill your passenger seat with a chat about classic cars, all recorded from my 1968 Morris Minor Peggy. I'm Becca, and today I'm out for a little drive after my weekend away in London. And that's going to be kind of the topic of today's podcast. We're going to be talking about the impact of ULEZ and other charges in London on classic car spotting whilst you're there, and whether it's kind of dampening a lot of the culture that has kind of grown up around the city and cars. So last year and this year, Jamie and myself have taken a couple of days to go down to London, give ourselves kind of a car-free weekend, and celebrate our anniversary and kind of Valentine's Day. So we picked kind of a weekend around that and head down to London. We have a couple of days down there at either side of a weekend, and just kind of do a few touristy bits and stuff. And whilst it's supposed to be kind of a car-free weekend, both times that we've done it, we found ourselves kind of car spotting whilst we're out and about, pointing out interesting cars that we see to each other and things like that. And the difference being that last year when we went, the ULEZ expansion and harsh punishments and stuff like that hadn't yet been introduced, and this year it has been in place for some time now. So I was kind of curious to see if it was going to impact the sorts of cars that we saw, how often we saw cars, and whether things like that were going to be impacted. We were staying quite centrally in London both times, and most of our kind of walking about was kind of Oxford Street and outwards from kind of there. So we were quite central, so it wasn't that the ULEZ expansion had covered that area for the first time, but there has been a lot of talk about the fact that kind of the car culture that's happened in London would be affected by ULEZ, and I've obviously had the opportunity also between these two events to actually drive a car in London for the first time with my trip down to the RAC earlier this year. So I thought it'd be interesting to kind of talk about my experiences of spotting cars and stuff both times, and kind of what I think the actual impacts of ULEZ are, and possibly link it into some of the criminalisation. A lovely person over on Twitter actually linked the ULEZ criminalisation stuff to last week's podcast, and that's kind of fed into some of my thoughts from this weekend. So last year we were staying on Gloucester Place, and we were walking in and around a lot of Baker Street and some of those sorts of streets, and we had quite a lot of success with spotting cars. We saw an absolutely gorgeous Bristol, I think it was, as well as some kind of interesting, expensive, modern stuff. And I uploaded quite a few photos to Twitter at the time of things that we were spotting on the daily there. And so we had quite a lot of fun when we go out for a walk in the evening to get food, spotting cars parked up and cars out and about driving and things in the evenings. Obviously the bonus of kind of after 6 o'clock is that your congestion charges no longer apply, so might be the ideal time to bring a car in and around London, certainly what we did with Peggy. And I would say that last year we had more success than we did this year. We spotted some interesting stuff this year. For example, in Camden on Saturday, we spotted something that I think was a Triumph. It went past reasonably out the corner of our eye, but it was definitely kind of 70s sports car-ish. And we spotted a Merc convertible, so two convertibles actually, on the Sunday night, I think it was, when we were sat having dinner at a place in the kind of edge of Soho. And so the weather down in London this weekend was great for your open top convertibles and stuff, and I did say to Jamie it must be quite fun to kind of take in London at night from a convertible, and kind of go around the streets like that, especially in a car that is ULEZ exempt, and after kind of congestion charges apply. And so this is perhaps something that's been added to my bucket list from seeing these guys out and about enjoying themselves in their cars. We spotted a VW Beetle that was incredibly lowered and a VW Camper that was incredibly lowered going past Liberties at the end of Camden Street on Regent Street, up towards Regent Street even. But aside from that, most of what else we spotted was kind of in shops and kind of not really out and about driving. The rest of what we saw was a couple of modern stuff, like a really nice G-Wagon that was in a nice green colour. But yeah, it didn't feel like we were seeing and spotting as much. We were doing much of the same routes and stuff that we were doing in previous year, and yeah, didn't feel like it was quite as kind of car heavy as it had been in previous years. So I find it hard to believe that we weren't spotting stuff and noticing stuff, because I think we're definitely enough car-minded that we would be doing that. So I think it's actually just a case that there was less cars about, and it's difficult to say that that's ULEZ related when it's central London and stuff like that. But I think it brings up this conversation about whether London has lost some of its car culture as a result of some of this, but also whether ULEZ is actually doing what it set out to do. Because we saw more kind of classics this time, I guess, than kind of unusual 80s and 90s stuff, which wouldn't necessarily fall into the ULEZ exempt. So that might explain, fit into that understanding of what's going on. But in reality, being as central as it was, it's not stuff that's been taken in by ULEZ. On the other hand, on the outskirts, we are seeing more and more stuff starting to be impacted. I know people have heard anecdotes from people of friends and family who have given up perfectly acceptable and reasonable cars that were only used to kind of go out of London most of the time, and had to purchase something else purely because it wasn't ULEZ and it wasn't worth them paying the £12 every time it left their driveway. And it's created this culture of kind of criminalising. It's not criminal to have these cars, but it costs money to have them. A lot of the people that are having to make these decisions are kind of not going to have lying about, and they're just going to go for an easier option of a supposedly greener car. We've spoken before on the channel how often the greenest car that you can have is a car that's already in existence and is being maintained and kept on the road and looked after, and having kind of small bit parts replaced over time, rather than a completely newly built car that is going to have other costs associated with it as it goes along, but also has that initial footprint output. And with all these people perhaps having to replace their cars with cars that are going to fit into this ULEZ bracket, some of them will be reaching for newer or newly produced cars to fill that gap. And it's a shame that's kind of what's being perceived as greener. And there's two aspects of this greener kind of thing. It's what's coming out at tailpipe, and it's what's actually kind of being produced overall. It might be reducing kind of the smog and stuff like that we see in London, but overall as a planet is more detrimental. But also a lot of what comes out of the tailpipe of a car, if it's correctly set up and stuff like that, isn't any more damaging. It's just a case of keeping the numbers low enough in those places which the congestion charge was kind of already covering. It does mean that kind of driving and things in London is less accessible, and it creates this kind of culture of people being priced out of being able to own cars in the centre of these big cities. But living in the centre of these big cities doesn't always necessitate owning a car. Yes, it's fun to if you're into kind of car culture and stuff like that, but it's not necessary in London because of all of the kind of public transport and stuff that's available. What we might need to worry about is the introduction of these ULEZ zones and congestion charges and things in cities that aren't so well infrastructured and supported, and what that might do for kind of car ownership and car culture and pricing people out of being able to live and be mobile in these towns and cities. In terms of what it's doing for kind of the car culture in London, I'm still seeing lots of events and stuff popping up, and there's been things like the Enfield show that's continuing on to put lots of good kind of coverage out there of car ownership in the kind of outskirts of London that are now included within a lot of this. But there have also been shows that have been cancelled, and some of this is down to rising costs of venue hire and putting events on, and just general difficulties in being able to cover those costs. But some of it is down to the fact that they're concerned that they're not going to get the footfall and the attendees and the interest that is going to make those rising costs worthwhile. And that is definitely something to be concerned about for a lot of those event organisers, and it's a shame to see some of these long-running shows starting to struggle as a result of that. While ULEZ itself isn't kind of criminalising car ownership, it's just perhaps making it less accessible and more tricky to fall into those loopholes. What has been interesting, and this is what was pointed out to me on Twitter, is the rise of activity in kind of protest against a lot of these behaviour restrictions, the covering up of the cameras and stuff that allow number plates to be scanned, whilst admirable, does technically kind of fall under this illegality loophole. And we talked a little bit about it last week in terms of perhaps the Marxist theory of the bourgeoisie bringing in these rules that aren't really going to affect them, but the working classes struggling to kind of continue to conform to them, and perhaps looking for ways around them. And this kind of united front against some of these cameras of covering up them with bags and stuff like that has been kind of quite interesting to watch unfold as a criminologist, because it shows kind of the rules that are being created aren't necessarily supported by the masses, and whether that means that our kind of legislation is no longer reflective of the people that it's supposed to be there for, or whether there's a disconnect between the public understanding as to why those rules are being introduced and kind of their relationship with it, because there might be some that argue that actually yes, it is beneficial to introduce these rules around ULEZ and things like that for making the place greener and kind of cleaner air and things like that. But the fact that kind of historic vehicles are still able to continue to drive around and are often argued to be less green at tailpipe emissions doesn't really fit with that disconnect. And the fact is that if they did introduce stuff like that, some of the really key parts of London's car culture would really struggle. For example, I think we all agree that one of the most key events in London's calendar is the London to Brighton run in November, and if we were to crack down on historic vehicles and their legislation, admittedly the cost and things associated with owning one of those cars, and then the entry cost and stuff like that, a couple of extra quid on covering your ULEZ fee for that day perhaps wouldn't put a lot of the owners off, but it would be kind of an interesting thing to see debated and discussed. The thing is, this kind of arbitrary 40-year rule isn't always reflective of what the scene is interested in and what is actually kind of in need of saving. And actually a lot of the cars that had kind of continued their lives as little runabouts with low mileage have started to struggle in London with these costs and have been gradually moving out. And there's been plenty of coverage of that on social media. There's been people that have been trying to help rehome some of these cars. Hubnut himself ended up rehoming and then passing on a car that fell into that kind of category, and as a result of that, we're fortunate that some of these cars have been saved, but I imagine a lot of loss has also happened to some of these cars that the owners didn't realise the interest that might be there for them, and have been forced into a tight spot. But it's not the first time we've seen this. We've seen the scrappage scheme do similar damage before, and we've managed to come out of it and even kind of make a bit of a joke about some of these scrappage scheme survivors. And equally, there's been high profile cases of individuals in these places starting to kind of act out on these rules. So for example, one of my favourite stories is the fact that the car I came home from hospital in when I was born is in itself a scrappage scheme survivor. So for those of you who don't know, when I was born, my parents owned a 1969 Singer Vogue, which is in the Hillman Hunter style. They sold it to a lady who had it for a while, and then eventually she took it to Kia as part of the scrappage scheme because she needed a car that she could actually drive and access, and it was the quickest and easiest way for her to get hold of a car that was going to be usable to her. So she took this car there, and the Kia dealership said, actually no, this isn't something we feel comfortable with scrapping. We will still give you the money towards your new car, but we will sell the car onto a dealership, and as far as kind of MOTs and tax and things like that suggest, the car is still out there. So it survived somebody trying to take advantage of the scheme to kind of make themselves continue to be mobile, and they've then been able to keep that car going. So there are individual acts of heroism whenever these sorts of rules are introduced, and hopefully it's enough to kind of keep a lot of these cars on the road. a little bit of a roundup of some of my thoughts from my weekend in London. We had a fantastic time, and yes, like I said, whilst it was still intended to be kind of a bit of a car-free weekend and a break from cars before things really start to ramp up next month, me and Jamie had fun spotting cars. We took a load of photos with cars and stuff in like the Lego store and other places where we spotted them, and had quite a lot of fun at the F1 arcade near St Paul's. And if you are able to get to that one or the one in Birmingham, I'd highly recommend it. Is quite a lot of fun, and we played on a relatively easy mode, but still had quite a lot of fun. I'd love to hear what your thoughts are on terms of whether we think London's car culture, but also perhaps other cities' car cultures, as we see some of this stuff be introduced elsewhere, is going to be massively impacted by the rise of these sorts of regulations and rules, and what we think we as a car scene should be doing to kind of protect some of our valuable classics from these fates. But in the meantime, thank you ever so much for listening. Drive safely and happy motoring.